The Heartbeat in the House, Episode 6, Sporelli Paranormal Investigations. Written by Kate Beret. Narrated by Roberto Scarlato. Chapter 1. Jack scrolled down the spreadsheet on his laptop. Even with the 15% loss of stock the junk shop had recently suffered, it looked like they were in the black. He leaned back in his chair and looked for his furry buddy Bob. Only a bit of Bob's magical luck could make up for a fire inside the shop. Not that he could blame Marin. She had been trying to save him from kidnap, torture, and possibly the sacrifice of his soul to a magical book. What was a little dragonfire damage when compared to the sacrifice of his soul to an evil book? But he could hardly give his insurance company those particular details, so he'd taken the hit. And still the shop was in the black. Bob had curled up atop of one of the sweatshirts he'd thrown on the old leather sofa in his office. "Thanks, Bob." Bob picked his head up from his front paws and tilted his head. "Looks like the shop bills are getting paid this month." Bob didn't acknowledge Jack's thanks. He just went back to sleep. Marin had mentioned Ark and Sonny were shy about the help they gave. Really, they seemed shy about a lot of things. Jack had never seen Bob eat or exercise. He hadn't seen the guy do much but sleep. He might look a little like a mix between a corkscrew-tailed lab puppy and a hedgehog, but he certainly didn't act like either. "Grab?" Bob perked up. As soon as Jack stood, Bob hopped off the sofa. Jack retrieved one of his stashed cans of crab meat, opened it up, and dumped it in a small bowl he kept in the office just for Bob. He set it on the ground and walked out to the main shop floor, closing the office door behind him. The bowl would be pristine when he came back, but he'd never once seen Bob eat. Jack wasn't worried Bob would vacate the premises if peppered with too many questions. Their relationship had evolved beyond that. But he didn't want to offend the polite little creature. Bob was great company, and not bad for the junk shop's bottom line. Marin looked up from behind the counter where she was ringing up a customer. "Here he is now. Jack, Mr. Kaiserman wanted to meet you." Odd. Bob didn't usually stick around when customers came into the store. Maybe he was really hungry today. "I'm Jack Sporelli." Jack extended his hand as he approached the older gentleman. The man offered him a frail hand, but his grip was firm.
"Sporelli Paranormal Investigations?"
Jack nodded. "Yes. How can I help you?"
"It's possible I might need you to—"
Kaiserman paused, and his gaze drifted away for a second, but then his expression cleared.
"Exterminate a building."
Exterminate? Pest control? Unlikely. Blow it up? Jack knew his morals could occasionally be skewed in a direction that didn't directly align with the law, but blowing up a building? "Maybe you'd like to join me and Marin in my office?" Marin was technically just his assistant, but that seemed an inappropriate label, given their ongoing partnership negotiations.
"Yes, of course."
Kaiserman didn't seem to notice Jack's hesitation, or was too polite to show interest. As Kaiserman made his way through the twists and turns of the display tables to the back of the store, Jack realized that the man's frail appearance belied his grace. When Jack opened the door, there was no sign of Bob, or of his sweatshirt. Jack indicated one of two client chairs. Marin sat on the sofa, and Jack took a seat behind his desk. Picking up a pen, Jack said, "Now tell me about this building." Kaiserman rattled off an address on one of the major highways in town.
"The government has asserted its right of eminent domain and has been pursuing condemnation of the property. They've offered a fair price, and truth be told, I'd be glad to relinquish the responsibility of the property."
Jack waited while the Kaiserman considered his words. Kaiserman pulled on his right earlobe.
"Well, the building, it's a house, really. was left to me by my father, and his father left it to him, and so on.
The house has sentimental value? Marin asked.
Oh, nothing like that. It's a more familiar duty than anything else.
Kaiserman's bushy gray eyebrows did a little dance as his brow furrowed and smoothed.
The house is special.
Haunted? Jack asked. He had some experience with ghosts. Generally, he wasn't a fan, though he knew there were better and worse ghosts. But the thought of having to exterminate a ghost gave him indigestion.
Ah, I hadn't considered that. Ghosts, they're real, are they?
We offer clients an evaluation of their property. We can check and let you know what we find, but in my experience, it's unlikely that your property is haunted. Jack wasn't about to confirm or deny the existence of ghosts. Spirelli Paranormal Investigations existed in the mundane world as a skeptical believer in the paranormal, more concerned with debunking paranormal fraud than proving it.
Yes, well, maybe that would be wise, just to be sure. But that's not why I'm here. No, it's the house itself.
Kaiserman shook his head.
It's mad. Not really believable, but, well, just in case. I couldn't in good conscience just let them tear it down.
What's mad, Mr. Kaiserman? Marin asked. We can't help you if we don't understand the nature of the problem.
The house is magic.
Kaiserman sighed.
That's what my father was told, what he told me.
And by magic, what do you mean exactly?
I'm not entirely sure. My grandfather called it a refuge, and he warned we shouldn't ever let anything happen to the house, but he didn't say why.
Kaiserman pulled at his earlobe again.
There's a trust for the house's upkeep. And you have to understand, my family isn't particularly well off, but that trust is a good chunk of change.
So whoever set up the trust thought maintaining the house was very important. Kaiserman nodded.
My grandfather, I believe, though I've no idea where he got the money, and while I'm not in any particular need of those funds, my father didn't have much growing up. They didn't have that kind of cash to spare.
Jack considered the facts. Where there was money, there was usually a fix. If you have the funds, why not move the house to another location, magic and all? I'm not entirely sure what you expect us to exterminate.
I'm not certain I can move it. Not with the...
Kaiserman spread his hands wide.
Well, the other intangible aspects still attached. I don't know much about the house. My father died when I was young, so he either didn't have time to tell me, or he didn't know himself. But
you're leery to move it, not knowing what makes the house so special. Marin leaned forward. Banishing any trace of her creepy dragon vibe, she gave Kaiserman a calm, reassuring smile. It's wise to be cautious. Certainly, but if you're not certain why your father called it magical, then that's the place to start. Depending on what, if anything, is there, it might not be possible to remove it. Kaiserman nodded.
I did have a structural engineer take a look, and he couldn't see any reason we couldn't do it. So if you can prove there's nothing special about it, then that would mean I can move forward. Or if there is someone, metaphysical or paranormal presence, then I'd like reassurance that it's safe to move, or a way to get it out of the house.
Jack pulled a contract out of his right-hand desk drawer. After filling in a few blanks, he passed the document to Kaiserman. If you fill in the address of the property, initial the space next to the fee in the second paragraph, and then sign and date on the last page, we can schedule the inspection of the property. As Marin said, that's the place to start. Note that the fee listed includes only the inspection of the property. If we discover anything, we'll discuss your options and the accompanying fees.
Yes, that's fine.
Kaiserman scanned the document and then quickly filled in the appropriate spaces. Handing the document back, he said,
When can you see the house?
Jack pulled up his calendar on his laptop. This afternoon? 3 o'clock? With any luck, he and Marin would be out of there in 30 minutes and would beat most of the afternoon traffic.
I appreciate your promptness.
Kaiserman stood up and pulled a key from his pocket.
I hope you're comfortable going on your own.
When Jack nodded and accepted the key, Kaiserman extended his hand first to Marin and then to Jack.
I've been uncomfortable with moving forward. This will put my mind at ease.
But his tone didn't entirely match the confidence of his words. After the front door shop bell had rung, confirming Kaiserman's exit, Jack leaned back in his chair and propped his feet on the desk. What do you think? Someone died in the house, and there's a family legend of ghosts? Or the place is just old and spooky. It doesn't take much for a legend to develop. Marin tilted her head. Although to set aside significant funds for the maintenance of the place, that does raise the bar somewhat. Well, whatever the reason for the family legend, I'm betting $50 we're out of there in less than 20 minutes. Watch it, Jack. You of all people should know better than to tempt the fates. Marin flashed him a toothy smile. Oh, and I'll take that bet. Chapter 2. Holy shit! Jack took his magic specs off, scrubbed at them with the hem of his t-shirt, then put them back on. Unfortunately, scrubbing the glass clean didn't change the brilliant vision in front of him. Yeah, I'll take that $50 now. Marin's gaze remained riveted on their client's house. Jack could only imagine what it looked like through her dragon eyes. Is it even safe to go inside? Let's see. Jack touched her forearm as she started to walk forward. As my soon-to-be partner and the supposedly more informed and level-headed of the two of us, are you sure that's a good idea? I can't tell what kind of magic it is, but Mr. Kaiserman said the house is a refuge. Does that sound dangerous to you? A refuge for ghosts, demons, dragons, witches, or who knows what else. So, yeah, maybe dangerous. Jack turned back to the house. He could barely look at it straight on. The walls of the house seemed permeated with magic, as if the stone facade itself were constructed of magic. What demons have you ever run into? Ghosts aren't always an issue. Dragons, no problem. And if there are Coven of Light witches hanging out plotting the end of the world inside, the magic would taste different. Marin cocked her head. I think. Besides, when are you cautious about anything but driving? I'm not a cautious driver. You're a maniac. The response came automatically. Jack wasn't really paying attention to her, because he couldn't take his eyes off the house. The glasses slipped from his nose. He blinked and found that Marin held them between her fingers. She inspected them, and then said, Mundanes using magic gadgets don't have the same skill and understanding as a magic user. I got it. He retrieved his magic-imbued spectacles, but scrutinized the house without them. Probably 1920s, pier and beam, a local stone facade that didn't look original. The house also had some other upgrades. The windows looked energy efficient, and the roof was new, but the owners had refrained from adding any square footage to the house. The entire structure couldn't be more than 1,000 square feet. No stink of death magic, nothing that looks like witch magic. Marin raised an eyebrow. What did you see? For the last several months, Jack had been trying to learn to interpret the type of magic he viewed through his magic specs, but progress had been slow. Apparently, the level of difficulty in recognizing the type of magic was much greater than its mere presence. A shit ton of magic. Well, that's what I see. Hard to say what, because there's just so much of it. But like I said, nothing that's obviously death magic or witch magic, if that comforts your newly cautious soul. Let's go. I'll follow in your footsteps, without the glasses. so don't get me blown up or trapped." Marin didn't respond, just pulled out the key Kaiserman had provided and made a beeline for the front door. She unlocked and opened it, but then hesitated on the threshold. She leaned closer then anyway, took a small step forward, and then backed away. "It's thick, sticky almost." "You have got to be kidding. Like that spurned lover's ghost trap we got stuck in?" "No." Marin stuck her arm through the door. "No, completely different." She pulled her hand out and turned to give him a pissy look. "I'd hardly call that poor woman, left by her husband to rot in some old house in the middle of nowhere, a spurned lover." "Fair enough. How about the trap laid by the crazy lady in the woods? That better?" Marin turned her attention back to the doorway without commenting. Probably because he was right. She'd been crazy. Possibly because her scumbag husband had given her syphilis. But that didn't make her less crazy, or less dangerous. He shook his head. He should not feel bad. Shit. He would feel like an idiot, apologizing for calling the old bat exactly what she'd been. Dick or idiot, great choices. He swallowed. "Sorry," Jack mumbled. "You should be," Marin said, then pushed her hand through the doorway again. "It's a few inches thick. Hang on a minute while I double-check that I can get back out." Jack shook his head as she walked through the front door. Maybe the two of them together as partners wouldn't work out as he'd planned. She was supposed to be the voice of reason. Marin might be young by dragon standards, early 20s in human years, according to her driver's license, but that was still well over 100 calendar years. Experience should equal wisdom, right? And there was also the whole two heads are better than one philosophy. He'd clearly placed too much weight on the strategic advantages collaboration would bring to their cases. Then again, they weren't actually collaborating. She walked back out, giving him her toothy grin. "I get to win $50 and raise your blood pressure. Not bad for a single day's effort." As soon as he'd made that bet, he'd known it was a bad idea. So, what's the verdict? "The amount of magic involved here is astounding. There's no hindrance to entering or exiting, but I can't tell exactly what the magic is doing. It's all over, in and around the house, but doesn't serve any obvious function. You want to give it a try?" Jack rubbed his neck and followed her into the house. He slowed as he crossed the threshold, waiting for something. Some sense of magic, or the resistance Marin had mentioned. But he felt absolutely nothing. No resistance, and certainly nothing he'd describe as sticky. The interior of the house surprised him. Kaiserman's family had not only updated the house, they'd kept it furnished. The front door opened directly into a comfortable, well-maintained living room. The furniture looked mid-century modern, the rug imported, and Jack didn't spot a cobweb or dust bunny anywhere. "Not what I expected either." Marin sat down in a green velvet armchair. "I'd say cozy, and he's had the maids in regularly." Jack nodded. "And the magic?" "I've still got no sense of the type, but my best guess is spellcaster." "Yeah, makes sense. The magic is tied to the house itself, and binding magic to objects falls within the purview of spellcasters. Is there any other type of magic user that could do this?" "With the Coven, I never like to guess. Pursuit of knowledge at all costs is a motto that lends itself to a broad array of magics, so even if it doesn't look like elemental magic, it could still be witch-related." "Okay, but best guess?" "Best guess, no. I still don't think it's witch magic." Jack lifted his specs. "Think they're safe to try?" "If the shiny lights mesmerize you, I'll take them off." "Thanks." Sometimes he really wanted to kick her ass, but he'd only fail miserably. He slipped the horn-rimmed glasses on. I got nothing." What? Marin took the glasses from him. Ah, I think you've run your battery out. When was the last time you had a spellcaster charge them? Jack shrugged. He knew exactly when, but telling her he'd done it last week wouldn't change the fact that they were toast. He retrieved the glasses and tucked them into one of the pockets of his cargo pants. Speaking of batteries, Marin stood up. Right. Let's do a walkthrough and maybe I'll get a hint of what's powering this thing. I don't suppose there's any chance of a magical wellspring in the Austin area? Marin poked her head into the kitchen. A massive magical power source in the middle of Texas that no one's noticed? Eh. She beckoned over her shoulder for him to follow her into the kitchen. The Interpack Policing Cooperative missed the one in Prague, but that was some time ago. They've got screening in place now that they know what to look for. Jack walked into the small 1950s kitchen. So, if there's screening, how does IPPC not know about this house? The magic practically blinded me. Marin opened and shut several cabinets. Excellent question. After she scoped out the interior of the oven, she stopped and turned to him. I didn't see it. Didn't even feel it. Until we were pulling into the driveway. How is that possible? Marin scanned the small room, focusing most of her attention on the exterior walls. I'm not sure. An uneasy feeling crawled up Jack's neck. Come on, let's check the 2 bedrooms and bath. Lingering doesn't strike me as wise. Marin once again preceded him as they walked through the living room into a small hallway. 3 doors opened off the hallway. Both bedrooms yielded nothing unusual, though one was furnished more as a sitting room. All of the furnishings were mid-century, in good repair, comfortable, and clean. Jack stood just outside the doorway of the bathroom as Marin stepped through. Oh, I want one of these. Marin traced her finger along the yellow tile. A green and yellow 1950s bathroom? Doesn't that conflict with your whole dragon philosophy of living in the now? And here I am thinking you don't listen. I can like vintage yellow tile and green sinks without having flashbacks to the 50s. Besides, I'm young. It's less of an issue. A good thing, too. Jack didn't have any desire to see firsthand what a dragon looked and acted like when it had lost touch with reality. Almost definitely catastrophically bad for all observers. So, anything more specific? Marin shook her head. I'm getting a massive collection of magical energy. I hate to say it, but... We need an expert. Jack tried not to groan. He thought he had an expert. But Marin was an adolescent in the land of dragons, much as it baffled the mind to think of any creature over the age of 100 as a kid. Yeah, let's get out of here, and I'll give my dad a buzz. So you guys, you're... Yeah, we're on speaking terms. I keep telling you, I don't have a problem with my dad. Jack bit back his response. Clearly something weird was going on with her family, but who was he to say? He had his own family shit. They retraced their steps back out of the house, down the hall, through the living room, and out the front door. He couldn't help it. He held his breath as they exited the house. Once outside, Jack did a quick check. All his parts were present, and Marin looked okay. You're good? She stared at the house. Give me a second. Jack stood in the drive as she disappeared around the back of the house. They probably should have checked the rear door when they'd been in the kitchen. Almost immediately, she circled back around to join him in the driveway. What's up? Jack asked. I'm just wondering, where does the magic stop? Where the walls stop? Jack pulled out his glasses again and put them on before he remembered they were out of juice. Shit. The bright light of the house startled him, and he yanked them off. What? I thought those were toast. Not toast. Definitely not toast. He handed her the specs. Check it out. Come on. Marin yanked a tuft of monkey grass out of the lawn lining the driveway, and then headed to the house. You have a theory? She paused on the threshold. Possibly. Let's see if I can burn a little grass. Ah, that doesn't mean what you think it does. But then Jack realized her point. Well, hell, that would be seriously freaky if you couldn't. I mean, that would be weird and very, very bad, right? But Jack was talking to Marin's rear and her curly red ponytail. He hustled into the house after her. No way was he missing this. She'd already moved into the kitchen when he came through the front door. Jack joined her just as she was placing the clump of grass into the kitchen sink. He should at least appreciate that she didn't test her theory out on any of the difficult-to-replace furniture. He watched her, watched the grass, back and forth like a tennis match. But nothing happened. I assume you're trying? And failing. She reached out her hand. Your specs? Jack handed them to her. After she closed her hand around them, she shook her head. Not even a little spark. I don't understand. You can see the magic in here, right? And feel and see it, just like before. But your specs have no magic, and my fire, it's... She tilted her head and handed back his glasses. I guess you could say suppressed? I don't feel as if I'm under any kind of attack. It's there, it's smoldering. I simply can't access it. Maybe blocked is a better description. Mr. Kaiserman called this place a refuge. A refuge from magic? Possibly. But how does a man with no magic get hooked up with a spelled building that blocks magic? And how does no one know about this place? And who used it and for what? Jack felt a tinkling of unease. This house could be a powerful weapon against the Coven of Light. Marin sighed. Yeah, which makes it a target. We need to find out what research our client has done, who he's reached out to, what bears he's poked. Jack motioned to the door and, when she nodded, headed outside. Speaking of our client, any thoughts about whether we can move this place? Marin closed the door behind her. I have some suspicions about the walls. I'm wondering if the magic extends to the foundation, perhaps beyond. I'm betting yes. So we measure how deep, somehow, and make sure the earth underneath is moved with the house. Jack rubbed his neck. Yeah, that sounded way less possible out loud than in my head. Exactly. How do we measure it? How do we leave those magical tentacles below the surface undisturbed, if they exist? And if we do disturb them, what happens? Wild guess that we don't want to know what would happen if the structure that all of that magic was tied to was destroyed. Marin huffed out an unamused laugh. Whatever happens, this building can't be demolished. Period. Pretty sure that's bad. Crazy bad. Shit your pants bad. Yeah, I got it. And I'm not looking forward to telling Mr. Kaiserman we don't have a clue what's contaminated or infested or possessed his house. So calling you in sooner rather than later would be a great idea. Will do. Marin pulled her phone out. Want to take bets on how bad this is? I'm going with worse than the time we blew up the really sad and misunderstood ghost. Marin raised an eyebrow. Way worse. Worse than the blood-sucking, soul-swallowing knife. Technically, that was a blood-sucking, soul-collecting knife and a soul-swallowing book. Marin rolled her eyes and tapped the number for her dad. Chapter 3. Because of the street noise, Marin had called Ewan from the Range Rover. It was still parked in the driveway of the refuge, and the house lurked off to the left, looking much less innocuous than when they'd first parked. Marin paused after explaining what they'd seen, and she and Jack both waited for his response. Sounds like a massive, magical bomb waiting to blow up. Ewan Campbell, a.k.a. Marin's dad and the chief security officer for the IPPC library, sounded deadly serious. I'm making arrangements to fly down. I should be there in 8 hours. Don't blow up Austin before I get there. Jack pinched the bridge of his nose. Ewan wasn't a drama queen by any stretch of the imagination. Wait, don't hang up. Marin's fingers tightened around her cell. I'm sure some assistant is making your travel arrangements as we speak, so you have a little time. Explain. Or you can leave us in the dark until you arrive, which greatly increases the risk that Jack will put his sticky, mundane fingers where they don't belong. Jack flashed her his best blandly innocent look. Since she glared back, he might have missed the mark. Ripping apart that building would be like setting off a small nuclear explosion in the middle of Austin. Think of the structure as the cohesive bond holding the magic together. Remove the building, and you melt the glue. No glue, and all the accumulated magic permeating the site is loosed on the city. Jack winced. Worse than the ghost trap. Worse than the bloodthirsty knife. Exponentially worse. What about exercising it? Exercising what exactly? Do you know why all that magic has accumulated? The clan is familiar with the concept of a refuge, certainly, but what makes it work? How it comes into being? Not at all. Ewan sounded impatient. Or maybe the guy was stressed. Jack didn't know how long the Dragon Clan had been around, but minimally, it was hundreds of years. If they didn't have the particulars on this house, then it truly was alien and rare. Maybe it was rare for a reason. If destroying the house is so dangerous, how can this refuge even exist in Texas? We're disaster central. Hurricanes, tornadoes, thunderstorms, hail, flooding, even the odd earthquake. Jack looked again through the windshield at the old stone house. And yet Austin still stands. Wouldn't be an issue. It's highly unlikely the house could be damaged by natural phenomena. A refuge should weather anything Mother Nature generates. Marin glared at the phone. Nature is fine, but a wrecking ball and a bulldozer will precipitate World War III? Hyperbole is hardly appropriate here. The reality is sufficiently dire. Ewan sounded about as peeved as Marin looked. So, Jack faltered. Meditation didn't top his resume, but the conversation was devolving. Maybe we should talk about this whole refuge thing. Ewan, do you have any information on what a refuge does, other than block magical energy? Just as the name implies, it's a haven from magical attack. I haven't heard rumors of one in years, though. There's usually a person, a mundane, attached in some way to the house. Probably the title holder of the property. Have you run into anyone that might fit the bill? That would be our client, Kaiserman. Marin had skipped over the case details earlier and focused on the house itself. Don't suppose you know why a mundane has the care of a magical house? Experience says it'll be a mundane. No idea what the connection is. Jack cleared his throat. We had a few concerns about the Coven of Light. Any way for us to know if this place is on their radar? I don't think it is. Ewan's voice trailed away. I have to leave. Don't mess with the house. Destroy the structure and... Boom! We get it. Jack scrubbed his face. Besides not blowing shit up, anything we can do to start sorting this out while you're in transit? Yeah, one thing. Ask your Arkan Sonny friend if he'd be willing to have a look at the house. I'd be interested to see if he has any insight. Bob? Jack shared a confused look with Marin. Sure thing. But why Bob? Just as dragon magic works differently from human magic, so does the magic of a creature like an Arkan Sonny. He may have a different and useful perspective. And I hear he's quite fond of you, Jack. Ewan seemed surprised. Hardly a compliment. Not that Jack would have commented, but Ewan had already hung up. Bob. That's weird, right? Can I ask him to check out the house? Marin tucked her cell in her pocket and pulled out her keys. I know his kind are shy, and they don't like to be acknowledged, but that ship has long sailed. You guys hang out in your office like antisocial teenagers, bonding over. What exactly do you do in there? We don't do anything. He hangs out, I hang out. We just kinda hang out in the same room. Right. What was I thinking that you might actually be doing something? Marin started the car. Either way, Dad's right. You guys are tight. And don't forget, you helped out his buddy Nelson. That's ballsy. Jack fastened his seatbelt. Fixing your screw-up hardly qualifies as helping Nelson. You're the one who accidentally left the interdimensional door open too long and too wide. Marin backed out of the drive and onto the highway feeder with a careless abandon that made Jack cringe. What? He discreetly pried his fingers away from the oh shit handle. The interdimensional door was too big. It wasn't open too long. Big difference. I was ignorant, not careless. He'd swear her nose twitched when she said ignorant. Whatever makes you sleep better at night, Jack said. Either way, the big bad creepy dragon got stuck in Nelson's attic, and that was all you. Marin snorted. She flicked the radio on, then thought again and lowered the volume. Talk to him. Ask him for his help. Jack tensed as Marin floored it onto the access ramp, with only one hand on the steering wheel. How do I do that? I'm not telepathic. He only communicates with other little Arcan Sunny. And dragons. You haven't figured out how to talk to each other? How long have you... She laughed. Never mind. I'll translate. Jack didn't see what the big deal was. They hung out. They shared space. Two dudes in one room did not a conversation make, especially if one was the size of an overgrown hedgehog and had no vocal cords. There was that one time, no, 2 times. He'd heard a tiny whisper in the back of his brain. But that could just as easily have been his overactive imagination, couldn't it? Chapter 4. When Jack and Marin arrived at the shop, Bob was waiting. Not in the office, but in the main part of the store. Jack locked the door behind Marin without a lot of fuss, hoping they wouldn't startle him into disappearing. Bob hadn't shown himself in Marin's presence since the ancient dragon fiasco. He and his Arcan Sunny friend Nelson had asked for help with pest control, reporting something nasty in Nelson's attic. That something nasty turned out to be an ancient dragon's essence, and its proximity to humans proved less than agreeable to their sanity. Jack tried not to linger over long on the mental health risks of prolonged exposure to ancient dragon essence, given the fact that he now housed that same essence in his own body, reformatted to reflect his human self. But even so, come on, Jack, focus on the issues of today, not the mistakes of the past. Why had Bob suddenly lost his shyness? Hey, Bob, any chance you can see the future? Bob's nose twitched. Jack glanced at Marin, but she shook her head. Bob wasn't giving that one up. Do you mind joining Marin and I in the office? Bob pivoted around and, with a jaunty little wiggle of his corkscrew tail, trotted away. When Marin and Jack joined Bob in the office, they found him not on the sofa or the client chair, his usual spots, but perched on the corner of Jack's desk. Jack estimated the height of the desk at about 2.5 to 3 feet, certainly higher than he'd ever seen the generally sleepy and somewhat lazy Bob jump. His small, plump body didn't look capable of the jump. Then again, Bob appeared and disappeared apparently at will, found modest treasures for the shop, and was tidier than any creature, human or otherwise, Jack had encountered. Bob's magic worked in ways that scrambled any logic Jack tried to apply to it. He wasn't sure why he kept trying. But they were here about the house, and Bob was looking on with keen interest, not at all like his usual sleepy self. 20 questions seemed like the best solution, so Jack asked, "Do you know about the house?" Bob nodded. Marin stood quietly to the side. Jack didn't think she could chase Bob off if she tried at this point. He looked downright excited. "You know about the magic in the house?" Another nod. So Jack asked, "And how the city wants to tear it down?" Bob nodded more vigorously. "And that we need to move it before the city can demolish it?" Marin broke her silence with a smothered giggle. Marin never giggled. "What's up?" "Bob says, and I quote, 'Big boom.'" She grinned at Jack. Jack groaned. "Yeah, we know. We're trying to avoid that." Head tilted, Bob blinked big, puppy dog brown eyes at Jack. Jack's store mascot was psychic, or maybe intuitive, or he had an underground network of gossipy Arcan Sunny friends who fed him with a constant supply of up-to-date intel. "Do you have a Friday night poker group or something?" Jack asked. He thinks you have a screw loose." Marin shrugged when Jack glared at her. "I'm translating loosely. Bob will meet us there, but he has something he needs to do first. He offers his apologies for the delay." "When's good?" Jack glanced at the clock. It was only just 5. "Midnight," Marin translated. "Any reason we're meeting at midnight?" she asked Bob. But when Jack turned to Bob, the desk was empty. Their furry friend had vanished. "Well, shit." Jack rubbed his eyes. "Did he at least give you any reason for the 7-hour delay?" "Things to do, basically. He's a creature of few words. But I've been thinking we need more information on Kaiserman's family, and I know where we can get started." Jack didn't like the cagey look in Marin's eye. "Can we eat first?" he asked. "Our source will be happier if she's fed, so we can eat there." Jack loved Indian food, especially curry, and this particular restaurant was one of his favorites. But it was a chain, busy, loud, and with a lot of shared seating. In other words, not a place he'd normally expect to meet and speak openly with a source. These days, everything he did had magical overtones. It was true that the world of mundanes lived in constant denial, but he hated to smack people in the face with the reality of magic when he could avoid it. He set the stand with his order number attached on the table. The corner spot Marin had chosen ensured they'd only have curious eyes and ears on one side. He took a seat facing the restaurant's only entrance doors. "So, who exactly are we meeting?" "Penelope Smythe is a special sort of friend." Again with the caginess. This lady must be shady. "Special, as in your girlfriend? Or special, as in talented?" "Talented. And not that it's any of your business, but we're not quite that friendly." Marin wrinkled her nose. "Fair warning, Pen doesn't particularly like people." "No problem. Antisocial means less chit-chat." "No, she's social enough. Just not keen on humans." Marin leaned a little closer and lowered her voice. "Kelpie." Jack hadn't run into one of those before. Some kind of sea creature? "Oh, no. And don't even think about mentioning the sea. She's a freshwater beast, not salt." "And never the two shall meet?" Jack shook his head. "If you guys are friends, then dragons must pass muster. What's the deal with humans?" "First, we're more friendly than friends. Dragons are like puppies to her. You guys, on the other hand, are more like gnats." "That's more than a little unflattering. You're sure we shouldn't have waited to order?" Jack didn't mind avoiding the cost of an additional meal. But it seemed odd, especially given the fact that he ranked among the lower orders by Kelpie standards. "With what you're paying her, she'll be happy to pick up her own tab. She's charging us by the hour, and you will smile and pay when you get the bill." "Naturally. I'll pay for any services we use." But he'd smile about it when hell froze over. An older woman, hair neatly swept up into a tiny bun, entered the restaurant alone. Just as Jack had decided she was their dinner appointment, a younger man came in and hurried to catch up with her. A couple with small children? No way. Not at a business meeting. A teenager with a nose piercing and weirdly colored hair. Too young. A man in his 20s alone. Wrong sex. Then Marin stood up and waved. The cotton candy-haired girl waved back with a bright smile. Maybe not cotton candy, maybe more seafoam. Hell, like he even knew what seafoam meant. It was green, but not the color you got from being in the pool too much. As she approached the table, Jack could see a small metal dragon hugging the outer shell of her left ear. "Hi, Pen. How are you?" Marin hugged the girl. Marin with her bright red curls and unusual height, and Pen with her not chlorine green hair, piercings, and short stature, didn't even warrant a second glance from Grandma, family with kids, or single guy. Oh, and he'd missed the tattoos, also a green-blue color. He couldn't tell what they depicted because her billowing shirt would gape just long enough for him to catch glimpses of color along her collarbone, but no specific pattern. Of course, they could talk about magic here. None of the patrons would care or even notice. Man, he loved Austin. Pen held out her hand. Jack stood and shook it. She had a surprisingly businesslike handshake, not something he expected from a 5'0" teenager. Then he stepped back and truly looked, at her. Diminutive height, flawless skin, and the overall look she cultivated made her appear young. But those lavender eyes were anything but. He experienced the same chilling creepiness he'd felt the first time he'd encountered a dragon. What she presented to the world was not the reality of herself. "Good to meet you." He forced the words out. He hated the feeling, but he was experiencing a moment of Nat-likeness. You're different from the rest." She placed a finger on her chin and tilted her head. Even her mannerisms had an affected cuteness. "Just human," Marin spoke dismissively, as if what he was or wasn't had no part in their conversation today. A cat-like smile spread across Pen's face. "All right, then. That's a mystery for another time." She reached inside the large purse that was slung across her shoulder and pulled out a card. She handed it to Jack with another feline smile. "I'll just go order. Be right back." Jack sat and then looked down at the card in his hand. Beautiful blues and greens edged out with delicate gold scrollwork. Fine antiques and collectibles? How is that relevant to our case? Marin seated herself across from him. She has an extensive knowledge of the history of Austin. People may be insignificant in and of themselves, but they create beautiful things, and those pretty pieces are much more valuable with their human history intact. You mean provenance, right? Yes, but an object's history of ownership can also have significance beyond the provenance. A cute story sells well, a tragic one even better. But a true magic tale can have real power. Marin gave Jack a warning glance, but a hint of amusement tinged her voice. Pen tells a mean story. Be careful. Jack glanced over his shoulder and saw Pen was still at the counter ordering. How old is she? Very. Marin stared back at him blandly. Jack eyed the card and then Marin. Dragons as puppies. It was an interesting image. Quit looking at me like that. Marin snatched the card from his hand. Pen returned with a large glass of soda, a basket of naan, and her order number. As soon as she sat down, she tore into the naan. Literally, Jack couldn't take his eyes off her teeth. They looked white and even, like any other teen who'd spent a few years in braces. But then, a flash, a tiny moment where two images met, one superimposed over the other. Even, white, human teeth faded. Crowded, sharp, shark-like teeth flashed atop the false image of orthodontic perfection. Again, a chill crawled up his back. And since when did horses have pointy shark teeth? Either he needed to do a little research on kelpies, or legend got the whole horse thing wrong. Marin kicked him under the table. He glanced away. When he looked back, the bread was gone. "So, Pen, what have you found on Mr. Kaiserman?" Marin asked. Pen patted daintily at the corners of her mouth with her paper napkin. "His family has been in Austin for 3 generations. Before that, the Kaiserman family diverges into a German branch and a Polish branch. I'm rather partial to the Polish side of the family. There were a few jewelers in that branch." Her eyes glittered with an unearthly light. "But I suspect you're more interested in the family tree with connections to a refuge?" Jack exchanged a quick glance with Marin, but he couldn't read anything in her face. No, little Marin didn't spill the beans. But really, a refuge in Austin? She didn't have to. "So you know about our problem?" Despite Marin's caution, Jack couldn't help but hope that they might have found an ally. Allies were good when dealing with unexploded magical bombs. Pen flashed him a darling grin, devoid of any sharp edges or fangs. "I couldn't care less. That's your problem." Jack tried to wrap his head around that. How would the city of Austin exploding in a cloud of magical dust not also affect Pen? Including her home, her business, maybe her life. "Oh, don't think so hard. You might bust a blood vessel in your tiny little human brain. Humans come and go. Cities rise and fall. It's the natural order of human civilization. And I do love a good scavenge." She smiled sweetly, revealing a dimple. "But I wish you the best of luck. Citywide destruction would be mildly inconvenient." Before she could elaborate, if she ever intended to, the waitress arrived with his and Marin's food. "Please, eat," Pen said. "Mine will be along shortly." Marin started in on her tiki masala, so Jack took his cue from her. And he did love a good palak paneer. Pen leaned forward and inhaled. "Lovely. So, the Kaiserman family's German roots. There was once a refuge in the Black Forest. Oh, years ago." "And by years you mean what exactly?" Marin asked. Pen waved a dainty hand in the air. Jack noticed, for the first time, that her nails were painted a shade of light blue-green, very similar to her hair. "More than a decade. Less than a millennium." Marin sighed. "Pen, sometimes your sense of time is less than useful." Tiny little frown lines appeared on Pen's forehead. "It's all in my notes. Silly girl. Sometimes the story is bigger than the details. Pay attention." "Apologies." Marin's lips were tight, but the corners pulled up at the edges. Jack guessed laughing at the ancient, sharp-toothed creature might be perceived as a slight. "Where was I? Yes, the Black Forest. There was a house deep in the woods, a place to hide from the ill-intentioned magical beings of the day. Humans feared the dark, and places deep in the woods in those days." "They still do," Jack interjected. Pen raised a fine, pale green eyebrow. "True." She sounded surprised, but then she gestured dismissively. That human fear of all things unknown became the refuge's protection. A word here and there about witches and children and cannibalism. She snapped her fingers, and the refuge was safe from human intervention. The waitress interrupted them with the delivery of 2 meals, both ordered by Pen. Now aware that sharp teeth lay hidden beneath an illusion, curiosity pulled at him. He knew her predator's teeth would rip apart flesh as easily as the bread he'd seen her shred. Jack made himself look away. Eventually, Marin asked, "What's the connection between the house in the Black Forest and the refuge here in Austin?" Jack looked up and found that Pen's noodle dish had disappeared. "Between the houses? Oh, nothing at all." Pen began eating the remaining curry with no particular haste. But then she paused, wiped her mouth, and her eyes narrowed.
That house deep in the forest came to an unfortunate end, overtaken by a coven, tainted.
The hint of a snarl emerged, the impression given but no sound heard. But the anger, fury even, disappeared as quickly as it had manifested. Jack fought the urge to stand up and leave, quickly. Then his brain turned back on, and he remembered that the coven he knew, the Coven of Light, was no friend to him or his allies. The enemy of his enemy and all that? Maybe. But Penn seemed closer in definition to foe than friend. And then he caught sight of her plate. Even eating with beautiful table manners and cutting all of the meat into tiny bite-sized pieces, half of Penn's curry was gone. Marin kicked him under the table again. He'd be black and blue before the end of this meeting.
So it's the caretaker family that the Black Forest Refuge and ours share?
Marin asked.
In one, my little dragon.
Penn smiled with an almost maternal affection. Penn really did have a soft spot for dragons. The pastel hair and frail appearance had faded into the background, overshadowed by sharp, hard edges. The more Jack shared Penelope's company, the more he saw of what he believed was her true self. But the family has no magic. How could they create a magical place with so much power? Jack asked.
No human is capable of creating a refuge.
Penn stared at him. Her pale lavender eyes grew huge in her face, giving her an alien appearance. The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood at attention. She blinked, and her face softened, looking again like a normal human teenager. Jack exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until those freakishly bright purple eyes had blinked. So how are they created?
A house becomes host to the magic when a refuge is needed.
Penelope patted her mouth and stacked her second empty plate atop the first. Needed by whom?
By whomever needs it.
Penn's nose wrinkled.
Such simple creatures with such limited linear thinking.
As the simple linear thinking creature in this equation, he figured pushing for answers wouldn't get him much more. Jack looked to Marin for a cue, but she simply lifted a shoulder. Penn made the decision when she stood up to leave.
Thank you, Penn.
Marin leaned in and kissed the air, near Penn's left cheek. Penn hugged her.
Report and invoice are in the mail.
And then she left, leaving behind a faint scent of spring. Jack sniffed the air, the sweet smell of blooming flowers, the fresh smell of crushed grass, but underneath, a hint of fishy decay. Jack watched the door close behind her, then turned to Marin. He shook his head. Just bizarre. What's with mailing the report?
She means email. Trust me, she's very technologically savvy. And yes, a bit bizarre, by your standards.
So, you gonna tell me why we're not paying her for information on refuges? It's obvious she knows something.
Two different types of information. If she has it, we can't afford it. And no telling what she knows. Disinterest in humanity coupled with a fascination for the artifacts of human life, well, it makes for an odd hodgepodge of information.
Jack looked at the door where Penn had exited and felt that creep along his spine again. As he followed Marin out of the restaurant, he couldn't help but wonder how many more ancient, powerful, and not particularly friendly beings lurked around the next blind corner. Chapter 5. Several hours passed before Penn's report arrived in Marin's inbox. As Jack and Marin had waited, they'd done a little research of their own. Neither of them turned up anything online about magical refuges, and none of the sources they'd trusted enough to ask seemed to know much about them. Ewan probably had some nuggets he hadn't shared, but he hadn't yet arrived from Prague. Jack had sent a follow-up email to the client. Nothing too specific, just that he had an expert coming to take a look at the house. Marin had looked like she might keel over when she heard him explaining there'd be no charge since they'd booked the expert without the client's prior approval. It pissed him off. He wasn't a cheat, just perpetually 2 inches shy of broke. And charging the client for Bob's services when Bob didn't charge Jack, that was just shitty. He wouldn't abuse the client's or Bob's trust that way. Keeping the client in the dark about IPPC, that was entirely different, and Jack had no moral qualms on that front. When they'd updated Ewan on the plan to meet Bob at the house around midnight, he'd claimed he could make the meeting. Seemed tight to Jack. But as of a few minutes ago, Ewan had confirmed by text he planned to be there. It was right at 11:30, so Jack printed out an old-school paper copy of Penn's report, no laptop for this trip, and then he and Marin left for the refuge in her Range Rover. About 5 minutes into the drive, Jack flipped to the last page. Penn may have questionable eating habits, but she certainly came through. It looks like the Kaiserman family has been affiliated with more than just one refuge. She said as much at our lunch meeting. Jack braced himself against the door as Marin took a turn too fast. The pages crumpled in his fingers. He had to unclench his teeth to reply. Yeah, but she's listed 3 here. And if she's listed 3, there are probably more. She wouldn't reveal an undiscovered and still operational refuge. Not for the price we're paying. Possibly not for any price. Speaking of, aren't we owed an invoice? Marin stomped on the gas and switched lanes. Once I'm sure Austin's around to stay, then you'll get the invoice. No point in raising your blood pressure if we're all going to die. So practical and yet so pessimistic. Jack tried not to imagine a sum, failed, and decided he could wait for the real number. What do you think of the family connection? 3 refuges, 4 if you add ours, 2 countries, and 1 family. Marin glanced in her blind spot, then crossed 2 lanes of traffic. Too many coincidences become a pattern. Agreed. What I don't understand is how Kaiserman could be as unaware as he appears. How do you have a family background tied to a mystical house and not know it? No family myths, no guesses as to why the house has to be maintained, just a sense of duty to keep up the property. That's strange. You keep forgetting that you have a skewed viewpoint. You have this. It's like a talent. You see the magic that exists around you. Yeah, with the help of my magic-seeing spectacles. Marin snorted. That's not what I mean. You may not literally see the sparkle and shine of magic without help, but you see its impact on the world around you. You have an awareness that most humans not only lack, but that they actively work to avoid. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. It must be genetic. Or maybe I have ninja-like observation skills. Give a guy some credit, Jack said. Although I really don't understand how someone misses a dragon sitting on top of a moving car. Marin's lips pressed tighter together. Circumstances dictated that particular solution. I never said it was a good idea, just the only option. She shrugged. Most humans possess a constitutional inability to accept magic when the evidence is right in front of them. You're different, and I don't think it's your PI training. She arched an eyebrow. Or your ninja abilities. Whatever Marin said, he'd been a decent PI back before magic had jacked around with his and his friends' lives, so he definitely had mad ninja skills. Okay, so say our client can't see magic even though it's right in front of him. He has a strong sense of duty either to the house directly or to his family. Is that due to some magical influence? Or he's just a conscientious guy? We should have a little chat with Mr. Kaiserman after our midnight rendezvous with Bob. Marin exited the highway and this time cut across 3 lanes of traffic. Yeah. Once he was sure impact with another car wasn't imminent, Jack pulled out his phone. He sent a quick email, then stuffed it back in his pants pocket. I've requested an appointment at 10 tomorrow morning. We need to provide him with a more extensive update anyway. And by then, I'll know what IPPC decides is legit to pass along. Sounds like a plan. Marin pulled into the driveway a few minutes before their midnight appointment. After she parked, she gave the house a hard look. Did you notice the other detail Penn included about those 3 houses? Jack eyed the simple, well-maintained, and in most ways very ordinary house. Yeah, they all had a history. If the Hansel and Gretel story she told us over lunch was any indication, the stories were provided as cover to protect the homes from mundane interference. Yeah, I wonder why our little gem doesn't have some terrifying story attached to it. Marin shut the engine off. Are you kidding? Attach some story to the house and you draw attention. We live in the age of reality TV and sensationalism. We've moved from being terrified of the dark to being both terrified and fascinated. Absolutely ordinary is the cover story. You're not wrong. You remember the other thing your friend mentioned over lunch? That humans didn't create it? I've been thinking about that. Marin shifted in the driver's seat, getting more comfortable. Penn has a different view of the world and a bizarre sense of humor. Maybe she truly meant the houses aren't connected. The actual structures. Shit, that's right. She said something about the house being host to the magic. I would have asked, but she made it clear she wouldn't answer any more questions. Host is an odd choice of word. It implies a guest. So what type of guest is this house hosting? What type of magic? Even in the poor light, Jack could see that Marin looked annoyed. Or whose? She might have chosen her words carefully. No connection between the houses, but there could be a connection between the magic inside this and the 3 other houses. Jack suddenly felt very small. I have this weird image of all this magic roiling around under the surface. You know, like those illustrated pictures of magma they had in our Earth Sciences book as a kid. Marin snorted. Because we both had Earth Science as kids? Sorry, I know what you mean. Well, the magic had to come from somewhere. Someone had to make that house happen. It wasn't as if there was this burbling, powerful mass of mindless magic roiling under his feet. He sure as hell hoped not. Hey, you okay? Jack shrugged off the uncomfortable feeling of insignificance. Yeah, of course. Let's say the house is possessed by some benevolent entity that protects its occupants. Nuts as that sounds. But then how does the house get hooked up with the humans who act as caretakers? Jack pulled out a second file, one that contained a background on Kaiserman. What if Kaiserman is holding out on us? Maybe he knows more than he's saying. Marin's lips twisted. Really? Is that the impression you got? No. Jack flipped open the client's file again. Widowed, no children, no criminal background, excellent credit, lifetime Austin resident, retired at 60, volunteers at the food bank. He's the perfect, responsible, dependable person. No one's perfect. We're missing something, because everyone has flaws and secrets. Whatever it is, it's not jumping off the page at me. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. I can have Chris do a more thorough background on him, but she's already been pretty damn thorough. Skip it. Let's wait to see what Kaiserman has to say tomorrow morning, then go from there. Another set of headlights shone up the drive, and a second car joined them. 3 minutes to midnight, Jack said. Ewan must have managed to snag the IPPC jet. But agreed, we'll have a nice chat with Kaiserman tomorrow. Marin opened her car door, but abruptly stopped and didn't get out. You have got to be kidding me. Jack walked around the front of the Range Rover, and then saw there were 2 people in the other car. At first, he thought Ewan had a driver. Then he saw Ewan was driving and a woman was in the passenger seat. She stepped out of the rental car. Not just a woman. Heike, Ewan's girlfriend. As Jack approached, Heike pushed her short blonde bob back out of her face. Even in the dark, he couldn't miss the rock on her left hand. Not Ewan's girlfriend. Ewan's fiancée? Or wife? Chapter 6. Jack closed the short distance between himself and Heike. They'd met before, months ago, before Jack worked with IPPC. He'd been helping out his friend Kenna, and Heike had been a part of the solution. A genuine smile spread across his face. What an unexpected surprise! Heike smiled and reached out her hand. I heard you could use a spellcaster. The faint German accent she'd had the last time they'd met had almost vanished, probably from speaking a lot of English, with her maybe husband. Jack shook her hand and then turned to Ewan. The men briefly shook hands. Jack wasn't sure where he stood with Ewan after hiring his daughter. He didn't look like he wanted to roast Jack slowly or turn him into bits of ash, so that was a decent start. Jack turned to find Marin still sitting in the driver's seat, with the door open. If he had to drag her butt out of the car, he wasn't sure what he'd do, but he'd make her pay for it. God, he hated family drama. She jumped out of the car as if she'd read his mind, then shut the door with a little too much force. Heike, it's nice to see you. I didn't know you were coming. Marin gave Heike a quick hug, and she looked happy enough to see her. Dad? The curt nod in her father's direction told a different story. Jack pulled out his phone to check the time. Midnight on the nose. I'd rather not keep Bob waiting. Of course. Heike headed toward the porch, and everyone else fell in behind her. Still as no-nonsense as ever, Heike was, however, much softer around the edges than Jack remembered. Probably because she was happier and safe. He knew a little of her history, and he wondered if Marin did as well. Maybe he'd ask when they weren't in the middle of a city-leveling crisis. Or not. When the group reached the door, Ewan opened it and went in before Jack thought to stop him. Hopefully Bob hadn't arrived yet, or would stick around when a stranger opened the door. Jack was close on Ewan's heels, but he didn't immediately see Bob. He scanned the room, looking for some sign of him, and there he was, perched atop the mantel. If Jack didn't know better, he'd swear the little dude could teleport. Hey, Bob, how's it going? Bob sat, rocked back on his haunches, much like a dog, and watched as 4 people filled the small living room. Thanks for doing this. Jack remembered a little belatedly that Bob liked the formalities, so he hurried to correct the omission. Bob, I'd like you to meet Ewan Campbell, Marin's father, and Heike Schellig. And you know Marin. As soon as he'd started the introductions, Bob had stood up. He performed a careful little bow with each introduction. It's a great pleasure to meet you. Ewan returned Bob's bow with one of his own. Bob? A split second later, Ewan's lips tugged upward in the hint of a smile. Jack assumed Bob had replied to the curious note in Ewan's voice, because Ewan, like Marin, would be able to communicate directly with Bob. Maybe Marin was right and Jack needed some formal method of communication with his friend. Heike dipped into an approximation of a curtsy. Hi, Bob. Thank you for meeting us. Marin had closed the door quietly behind her, and now she stood next to Heike. Ewan approached the mantel where Bob was perched. Oh, he's a little shy of strangers, Jack said. And while Bob did back up, it looked like he was simply trying to keep Ewan within his line of sight. I'm just having a look at the mantel. Bob says the mantel is the heart of the house. No surprise there. That's an old concept. Turning to Marin, Ewan said, What do you think? Original to the house? Marin did a visual inspection. I think so. Looking at Bob, she asked, Do you mind? When Bob rocked back on his haunches into a sit again, she approached to examine it more closely. Yes, I'm pretty sure. What are you thinking? Ewan considered the mantel, and then his gaze swung wide to encompass the room. I think this is a spellcaster problem, and it had a spellcaster solution. We can't move the house, but what about the heart, the mantle, of the house? A little rejiggering of the magic? Oh, you want me to... Heike looked a bit pale, but maybe it was the lighting. Oh, I didn't think that's possible. At least, I don't know how I'd move quite so much magic. Marin squeezed her eyes shut. You guys want to clue in the non-magical guy? Jack looked around the room. Only Bob seemed pleased. Marin opened her eyes. If the mantle is the heart of the house, in other words, an object symbolic of the whole, attach all of the magic to the mantle and move the mantle. Theoretically, no big magical boom. Bob squeaked. At least, Jack thought the noise originated from him. He didn't even know Bob could make noises, but given how excitedly he was hopping up and down on the edge of the mantle, and that the noise came from his general vicinity, it looked like Bob could squeak. Okay, Bob seems pretty sure that's an excellent plan. Jack glanced back at his furry buddy. Right? Bob had stopped hopping, but he nodded several times. The only problem, Jack, is that someone has to shove all that volatile magic into that tiny little object. Marin looked less than thrilled by the prospect. That's me. Heike lifted her hand. I'm the only spellcaster around. That is why I'm here. Attaching magic to objects is a spellcaster talent. Ewan made a grumbling, annoyed noise. You're here as a consultant. As a consultant, do you think a spellcaster made this house? Heike didn't hesitate. No way in hell. Exactly. Manipulating magic that has an unknown source, that's hardly in the realm of spellcasting. Ewan clasped her hand and threaded his fingers through hers. That's a bad idea. It's your idea, and if you think Lizzie or Harry have time to fly out to Texas, well, think again, and I'm equally qualified. Not to be a naysayer, Marin said, because I'm on board whatever your decision, but you're only equally qualified because no one is qualified to do this. No one's done something like this before, have they? Everyone looked at Ewan. He was the oldest person in the room, barring Bob, but who knew Bob's age? There's a lot of magic here. Ewan ran his hand through his hair. You've never heard of a refuge being moved, and this mass of pure magic being manipulated? No idea. A little nudge to test the waters should be safe enough. Heike took a tiny step away from Ewan and said, We talked about this. Ewan shifted away from Jack and Marin, more squarely facing Heike. Now is not the time. Now is exactly the time. Heike crossed her arms. This is what working in the field looks like. Jack had a sinking feeling he was experiencing a marital disagreement. An ongoing marital disagreement. Jack tipped his head in the direction of the hallway. We'll just go check the rest of the house while you guys... But neither Ewan nor Heike was listening. They'd lowered their voices, but the intensity had escalated. Let's go. Marin beat a hasty retreat down the hall. Hey, are they married now? Jack asked when he caught up to Marin in the bedroom. Good Lord, we left poor Bob in there. She dropped down on the edge of the bed. I think Bob can take care of himself. Hey, speak of the devil. Bob was curled up on one of the decorative pillows at the head of the bed. You can seriously move when you're motivated. Jack smiled. He wasn't surprised that Bob had made a hasty exit. He seemed a low-drama kind of guy. What do you think? Is Heike going to blow us all up if she fiddles with the house's magic? Bob looked at him, and then he shrugged. Did you see that? Marin turned around. What? Nothing. Maybe this isn't a great idea. We have, another 2, maybe 3 days before the final appeal is resolved and the court determines damages? We can hold off for a better plan. If there's a better plan, Dad will come up with it. Did you see how wigged he was? And they're mostly married. What the hell is mostly married? They're human married. What? There's a dragon married? What the hell is that? Jack lifted his hands. Never mind. I don't want to know. So long as we get this shit sorted out with the house, we will. Right. I mean, without triggering some catastrophic event that kills all the little gnat-like humans. Marin laughed harshly. The dragons don't fare well in that scenario either. Penn's sense of perspective is heavily warped. Accept it and move on. Her gaze shifted over his shoulder. We can head back now. You with us, Bob? But Bob had once again disappeared. Crap. Marin, we lost Bob. Marin paused in the hallway. He's not especially social. Not with anyone but you. So no surprise there. Jack followed Marin back into the living room, but reluctantly. He thought Bob's retreat was more likely a desire to preserve his small furry hide than an expression of social anxiety. This time, whatever went awry, it wouldn't be his fault. Small comfort to his corpse. Chapter 7. Heike stood near the mantel, once again examining it closely. We reached an agreement. But Ewan didn't sound like he'd actually agreed to whatever Heike was about to do. Want to share the plan? Marin stopped just inside the living room, leaving only enough space for Jack to walk past. Jack glanced from Ewan, who wasn't pleased, to Heike, who appeared puzzled, to Marin, who looked like she wanted to leave as much as he did. Maybe I should get the rover warmed up for a quick getaway. Heike was too preoccupied to respond, but Ewan and Marin overtly ignored him. Jack took a breath and prayed to whatever gods might be listening, the dragon gods, if they had them. Finally, Heike looked up. It's fine. I'll just poke a little. I'll try to herd the magic into the mantle after I disconnect it from somewhere else in the house. Jack raised his hand. Not to bash a perfectly good plan, but isn't that exactly what we're trying to avoid with the demolition? Disconnecting the magic from the house? This is on a much smaller scale. Marin bumped him gently with her elbow. Remember our first case? At the end. And we did that group hug thing? What the hell was that supposed to mean? The end of their first case had been a massive explosion. Ah. Marin had disappeared him momentarily into the place she hid out when she ward-hopped. Yeah, sounds good. I'm all about group hugs. Only when they transported him away from big magical blasts, but no need to bust Heike's confidence by saying it. At least they had a backup plan, although it sounded like Marin was leaving her dad and Heike to fend for themselves, which was odd. Okay, it's basically a ward, right? But Heike's question was rhetorical. Her upbeat tone implied this was her version of a pep talk. All I have to do is unravel the magic from the physical anchor, just like I would any ward. He knew from past experience that Heike had serious spellcasting skills. She'd been hired by a ruthless egomaniac back in the day, before she started working for IPPC, and that guy had been particular about his employees. Only the best for evil mastermind bad guys. But this was a lot of magic, and Bob had disappeared, and Ewan seemed worried. Jack stepped a little closer to Marin. If he remembered right, they had to be touching to zap into Marin's hidey hole. Press your thumbs. Heike blinked and looked away from the mantle, then corrected herself. Sorry, cross your fingers, whichever. She ran her hand across the mantle until it met with the outer wall of the house. Fingers splayed against the wall, she closed her eyes and stood very still. Jack held his breath, but nothing happened. He forced himself to take a breath because, what was he, 12? Heike's eyes popped open, and she lifted her hand away from the wall. I can do this. It's not quite like spellcaster magic, but it's similar. Give me just a second. Ewan wore a pained look. The guy clearly adored his wife. He knew what Jack knew. Heike was a badass spellcaster, but that didn't seem to lessen his concern. Love did that. It made all the stakes higher. Let me try this again. Heike ran her hand along the wall, tracing a line visible only to her. She stopped and closed her eyes. A crack split in the air. The room trembled. It vibrated, sparked, and then grew dark. Jack fell to the ground. He looked for some sign. Of what? A shooter in the dim light? The telltale flash of lightning signaling a storm? A crack in the middle of the floor leading to hell? Light returned to the room, and Jack could see the comfortably stuffed sofa, the pleasant wallpaper, the decorative pillows. It all looked so terribly normal. He'd drawn his gun without thought, and he held it loosely now, feeling like an ass. Or that 12-year-old he'd felt like earlier. Right up until he saw Marin. She crouched low next to him, completely still, transfixed. He said her name quietly, but she didn't respond. He touched her shoulder. She didn't move, and she looked scared. Jack scanned the rest of the room, and he found Ewan and Heike similarly immobilized. And then a ripple, like a muscle twitching, passed through the room. Marin grabbed his arm and pulled herself up. It's alive! What? Jack glanced over his shoulder, looking to see if Ewan and Heike had similarly recovered. They had. Their heads were bent close as they exchanged urgent words. When Pen talked about the house hosting magic, she meant the house is host to some magical being. Well, shit. Jack looked at the gun in his hand and then holstered it. Hell of a lot of good a gun would do. Chapter 8. Heike felt a pulse. Ewan's voice sounded harsh in the sudden quiet of the living room. Yes, a pulse. An artery runs along there. Heike pointed to the right of the mantel, where she'd touched the wall earlier. It felt like a point of attachment. Wards are simply magic connected to physical objects, yes? I thought this line of magic was a place where the magic connected to the physical structure of the house. But it was more like an artery sending magic out into the structure. Ewan's gaze focused on the mantel, and Jack thought he saw a hint of green in the depths of the dragon's eyes. A crawling sensation made the hairs stand up on the back of Jack's neck. This cozy little nest of a house got weirder by the minute. A living house, a trembling house, a house with magic literally pulsing through its body. Jack couldn't reconcile that with the home that he saw around him. We need to leave, unless there's a good reason we're having this conversation inside the belly of the beast. He didn't wait for them to answer. Jack walked out the front door. Once in the front yard, the tightness in his chest and the crawling sensation running along his skin stopped, and his brain started to work again. Bob hadn't seemed certain what they were doing was safe, but he also hadn't warned them that they were about to do something terrible. Marin, Heike, and Ewan were close on his heels. Addressing his question to the two people who had the ability to communicate directly with Bob, Jack asked Ewan and Marin, "Did either of you get any hint from Bob that the house might bite back if poked? More importantly, that the thing is actually alive?" Ark and Sonny are known for their brevity, and he did say the mantle was the heart of the house. Marin sounded a little more flippant than the situation called for, but as easily as he could spot her pale face in the dark, he couldn't pick out enough detail to read her expression. So what you're saying is that hindsight is 20/20, but we didn't get a clear warning. Jack tried to keep the irritation out of his voice, but it was a half-ass effort. He was tired. If I'd received a clear warning from Bob, Ewan said, we wouldn't have proceeded. But speaking with an Arcan Sonny is muddled. There's room for interpretation. And error, Marin said. Heike sighed. I should have realized. But all of that energy masked the biorhythms. When I touched on the artery, I should have seen. No offense, but I don't think you're the only one who's feeling like an ass. We all feel like grade A idiots for missing the obvious. Jack rubbed his neck. I keep looking at it thinking it's going to look back with big glowing eyes. What are the chances it understands language? Slim, Ewan said. I have to find some other way to communicate with it. Bob saw more than us, as I'd hoped, but I doubt there was any substantial communication between him and the creature inhabiting the house. Marin and Jack locked eyes. They said in unison, Kaiserman. Your client, yes. He might be the key. But fair warning, Ewan said. IPPC didn't find anything noteworthy in his background. If he has a magical talent, it's well hidden. Probably even from himself. The man couldn't be more average. Marin pulled the Range Rover keys from her pocket. We have an appointment with him tomorrow, or today, rather, at 10. Unless we're worried about leaving the house unsupervised? No. Ewan opened the passenger door for Heike. We've got a confirmed late check-in with our hotel, so we're set for tonight. Let's reconvene after we've all had some sleep, after your meeting. Marin's step faltered. She quickly recovered and opened the driver's door. I'll give you guys a ring afterward. On the way home, Jack expected some acknowledgement of how Marin's family dynamic had played into the events, or an explanation of her stepmother's presence, or something about why her dad was ditching their client meeting tomorrow. Nothing. As Marin pulled in front of the shop, where Jack's car was still parked, he finally asked, You want to tell me anything? She stared straight ahead. You want to give me that partnership agreement? Jack pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. Done. That pulled her out of her funk. She turned to him with a frown. Are you messing with me? No. Check your email. 15% ownership, non-negotiable. We can revisit in a year or two. If they were both still alive and kicking. She turned back to stare down the street. I left to give them some room. No big deal, right? Maybe even kind of nice of me. She seemed to be looking for affirmation, so Jack threw up his hands. Yeah, sure. Newlyweds and all that. I mean, I've never been married, but why not? Well, he flips. Acts like I'm incapable of doing even the most basic things. Find a place to live, get a job, and don't get me started on the cooking. She sent a glare his way that he was glad not to have earned. Cooking. I mean, how hard can it be? Like I'm going to starve. You eat a lot. It was an unsolicited comment, and he had no clue why he said it. Just tired, probably. Her narrowed eyes lit with a green fire. I'm a dragon. I don't eat a lot for a dragon. And who are you to talk? What are you saying? Jack glanced down at his midsection. I run. And the bigger issue is dragons don't do well outside the clan. So I hear, though I can't say I see any evidence of that. I'm doing fine. Maybe it was a little rough at first, but I'm good, right? He nodded. Jack had forgotten, but she'd said before that the clan stuck together. I don't get what the issue is now, though. Whatever he said in the past, Ewan seems cool with your choices now. I mean, he hired us for a job. Jack would keel over in shock if his sister, or God forbid his mother, hired him for a gig. That's damned supportive. Marin just shook her head like he'd lost all his sense. Says you. He's totally checking up on me. You need some perspective. He hired us for that book retrieval job, directly. He could have had Harrington call. That's what usually happens. Jack held up a hand. No, hold on a minute. Then he left us to it. He let the no-talent human and his daughter retrieve a valuable book. That's trust. She scrunched up her nose. But he came this time. Are you kidding me? We asked for help. Jack couldn't help but lose his patience. This was ridiculous. She sounded like a teenager, or what he imagined teenagers sounded like. You're normally so reasonable. Take a step back and look at this without all of your weird family baggage. I think he's trying. Hell, I wish my family was half as supportive. Marin crossed her arms. You really think so? Good Lord, I just said it. Yes, I think so. He's not even coming to our client meeting, and I don't think that's so he can have a little alone time with your stepmom. Jack bit back a groan. He couldn't believe he was giving this advice, but ask him. What? This was downright painful. Ask him how he feels about you living in Austin, working for me. Hell, ask him how he feels about you making your own meals. Jack gave her an exasperated look. Who the hell usually makes your meals? Oh, we have a chef. But she wasn't really paying much attention to him. She seemed to be chewing over his advice. What the hell had the world come to if he was the guy providing family counseling? Chapter 9. The next morning, Marin arrived at the shop a few minutes after Jack. She didn't mention their conversation from the night before, and neither did Jack. But maybe she'd sort her family shit out now. If she did, maybe Jack wouldn't hold his breath every time he ran into the guy. Kaiserman showed up 15 minutes early for his 10 o'clock appointment. After he came through the front door, Marin locked it behind him and flipped the sign to closed. He followed Jack and Marin back into the office.
You have news, don't you?
Kaiserman looked from Marin to Jack.
Something's there, isn't it?
Jack walked behind the desk and indicated the client chair. After Kaiserman seated himself, Jack said, Yes, there's something there.
I knew it.
Kaiserman collapsed back into the chair.
Forget what my father said. I felt it in my bones. It's a ghost?
Marin perched on the edge of the sofa. Her hands clasped in her lap. No, not exactly a ghost, but something has definitely taken over the house. Jack realized belatedly that he and Marin should have come up with some kind of reveal strategy. Magic is real and your house is alive seemed somewhat abrupt.
Well, whatever it is, can we exorcise it?
Kaiserman's color wasn't looking so good. Can I get you a drink, sir? Jack thought back to the background on Kaiserman. He didn't think the old guy had any medical conditions they needed to worry about, but... Mr. Kaiserman, we think you might be able to help us resolve the issue with your house. Marin lifted her hand when he started to sputter a denial. We're aware that you're not involved with the magical aspect of the house, but it seems your family has some connection to whatever it is living in the house. Jack watched as Kaiserman's face turned from pale to ruddy. He rolled his chair over to the mini-fridge and retrieved a bottle of water. Jack handed Kaiserman the water bottle. We know this is surprising, but the stakes are high. The house can't be moved while the guest is in residence. My expert tried to communicate with the entity, but with no real success. Sort of true. Jack hadn't been able to grill Bob any further, because he'd been absent since last night. And as far as he knew, Bob didn't have an actual conversation with the house, although it would be nice to know for sure. Any insight into the psyche of the pulsating magic mass would be just fine by him. Kaiserman had drunk several mouthfuls of water and his color was returning.
And you think that I can communicate with it when your expert couldn't? I don't see how.
It's the family connection, Marin said. We did a little research on your family, and there's a connection going back years between your family and houses much like this one.
You traced my family history? I don't know about that. Well, you said the house can't be moved with this creature in it. What happens if I simply allow the city to demolish the house?
Jack and Marin shared a glance. Time for the ugly truth. It's possible, probable, actually, that there would be an explosion. Kaiserman laughed.
A magical explosion? You're kidding me.
His eyebrows beetled together.
What exactly are you charging me to prevent this magical explosion?
Marin gave Jack a subtle shake of her head, then said, "We understand your skepticism. Your evaluation fee will be sufficient. Given the nature of the problem and the far-reaching effects destroying the house would have, a private organization has stepped forward to absorb any costs."
That seems very irregular.
Suddenly, Kaiserman lowered his head and covered his eyes with his hand. When he looked up, he gave Jack a weak smile.
Ridiculous. We're talking about magic. It's not like I can get a second opinion. And I know, in my bones I know, there's something not right about that house.
Marin wrinkled her nose. In a quiet voice, she said, "If it makes you feel any better, there's solid evidence to suggest your house is a refuge of sorts, that the inhabitant might have a fundamentally benevolent purpose. It probably played a part in keeping someone safe from a truly terrible magical event." A rather generous interpretation of the minimal facts thus far gathered, but Jack wasn't shy of a little spin, and he nodded agreeably.
Well, if the thing is so benevolent, it would be neighborly of it not to blast the neighbors before they have a chance to clear out.
Kaiserman pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and blew his nose. Jack debated correcting Kaiserman's perception of the size of the blast, but what was the point? It wouldn't go that far. After all the pallor and stress and sneezing, Jack wasn't sure Kaiserman was up to a confrontation with his living house. Kaiserman's features hardened.
So how do I talk to this creature?
Or maybe that was the real question. Chapter 10. After deftly avoiding the how question that Kaiserman had posed, Jack and Marin made arrangements to meet him at the house at 2 o'clock that afternoon. That gave Kaiserman time to prepare himself to enter the house, something he was clearly reluctant to do. And it gave Jack and Marin a few hours to dig around for a viable method of communication between a human and a house. Jack wasn't holding his breath. After Kaiserman left, he and Marin had bounced around a few ideas. Thus far, no brilliant revelations had been made. "Do you think Penelope might give you some idea?" Jack rolled his chair back and propped his feet on his desk. "We have a very specific kind of friendship, one that does not include me picking her brain." Marin stretched out on the couch with her hands behind her head. "I doubt she'd know anyway. That's not the type of information that interests her. The story behind a vase or a mirror or a house, sure. Besides, she's not currently available. She's off on one of her treks. She calls them scavenges and can't be reached." Just a thought. Any other ancient, freakishly knowledgeable resources we haven't tapped? As Jack spoke, an image of Joshua flashed through his mind, which was profoundly disturbing. He didn't know what Joshua looked like, because he'd never seen the dragon's physical form. He couldn't because Joshua's physical form had long ago decayed into dust. And yet he saw a massive black dragon. And he knew it was Joshua. In his innermost self, he simply knew. "Jack?" Jack jerked himself back to the here and the now. A chill went down his spine. He was always here and now. He was no dragon, lost in the past. "Jack!" "What the hell?" "You need to get some more sleep or something. You're off your game." Marin was still lounging on the sofa, but her cell was in her hand. "I'm fine. What were you saying?" "Just that Dad checked in with the IPPC librarian, and they were working on it, but he's not hopeful." Jack shifted his feet off the desk and picked up a pen. Let's consider the possibilities. He tapped the pen on the blotter on his desk, then started to scrawl a few random thoughts. It helps if you say them out loud. Jack looked up from his short list. Yeah, not sure about that. I've got Vulcan mind meld, pictures via telepath, and genetic language. Star Trek? She might not have rolled her eyes, but he could hear the judgment in her tone. Are you kidding me? Star Trek is the answer more times than you'd think. Jack considered his list. Granted, probably not this time, but frequently. And genetic language? So, consider that there is a genetic component to the relationship between the Kaiserman family and the house. Why that family? Why one family? Genetic language, Marin said. If there's a genetic component and the Kaiserman family have some ability that isn't readily recognizable by the rest of the magic community, and that ability lets them communicate on a different level, beyond language. Marin raised an eyebrow. That's usually called telepathy, and dragons have that ability. If the house needs a telepathic connection to communicate, it could easily have reached out to Dad or me. But what if you're tuned in to the wrong frequency? The house is talking, but you're not hearing. Marin sat up. Oh, I never really thought about it, but Bob doesn't exactly come across crystal clear. Maybe we have overlapping but not entirely compatible telepathic communication. But if Kaiserman has some latent ability, wouldn't the house be reaching out to him? Who's to say it hasn't? You saw his reaction when we said something had taken over the house, and he keeps saying that he feels in his bones that something is odd about the house. Well, that's the first question when we meet up. Mr. Kaiserman, have you had secret dealings with the entity that inhabits your house? Jack grunted. I think I can manage a little more subtlety, thanks. Sure. Marin's wide-eyed, unblinking stare said otherwise. We should also talk contingency plan. If Kaiserman can't reach out to the house, or he can't convince it to retreat to the mantle and let us transport it somewhere safely away from civilization, then what? Any chance you and Ewan could disappear the house, magical blob and all, into the in-between place? You took me there to escape a blast. Would the opposite work? My gut says that is a very, very bad idea. But I'll ask Dad. Jack gave the various outcomes some consideration. It's possible we simply walk away from this meeting in a stalemate. A stalemate at this point is a loss. We're running out of time. Jack massaged the point where his shoulder and neck met. It seemed the pinched feeling kept getting worse each day. Communicate with the alien being inhabiting the house. Hope Kaiserman can not only speak its language, but well enough to explain the situation, and pray it doesn't hold the city of Austin hostage. Is it too late to take a vacation? Chapter 11. Jack drove to their apartment with Kaiserman. He wanted steady nerves when they arrived, and Marin's driving put him on edge. 20 peaceful minutes later, he pulled into the driveway. He shut the engine off, then took a moment to examine the house. It looks so harmless. Marin sat in the passenger seat. Hell, for all we know, it is harmless. The place is supposed to be a refuge. I've been wondering about that. A refuge for whom and from what? Marin asked. In every conflict, there are at least two sides. What's the conflict and who chooses which side receives refuge? Does it matter? Jack asked. They were too far into this mess. It wasn't like they could stop and evaluate the morality of dismantling a strategically important outpost, or a possible haven for an enemy, or an ally. The thought of an Austin post-magical apocalypse made his eye twitch and his neck hurt. And maybe the house doesn't take sides. If its magical signal jammer works indiscriminately, then there are no sides. Switzerland, huh? Let's hope. Marin sighed. It seems such a waste. As rare as these houses are, and the practical applications, which include being co-opted by the Coven of Light, better it's moved far away from a mainstream, well-populated area. Kaiserman drove up in an older silver Prius and parked next to the Range Rover. About that. Marin opened her door. We need the alternate house location from Kaiserman, and we should discuss whether IPPC should assume responsibility for the house. Jack suspected Kaiserman wouldn't let go of his responsibilities so easily. However uneasily they sat with him. Jack exited the car and turned to greet Kaiserman. He stood in front of his car, watching the house.
Still gives me the creeps, even after all these years. I can't remember the last time I actually went inside the place.
About that. Jack ignored Marin's half-smile. You say the house gives you a strange feeling. Is there anything specific you can point to? Kaiserman shifted uncomfortably.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Mr. Kaiserman, if there's anything at all, that relates to the house that you haven't told us, now is the time. Marin gave him her best, most engaging smile. When she kept the glowing eyes and teeth under control, she was a very attractive woman. And Kaiserman must have agreed, because he relaxed under the shine of her smile. He gave Marin a rueful look.
Nightmares. Not for years, but all of a sudden they've cropped up again.
And how are these nightmares tied to the house? Marin asked.
Sometimes I'm inside the house, sometimes outside, standing in the driveway, looking at the house.
He paused and glanced at the house.
Like now.
Suddenly Kaiserman stopped, distracted as Ewan and Heike pulled into the driveway.
These are your experts? The ones with the organization that's paying for this extermination?
Kaiserman seemed relieved to be interrupted, which made Jack all the more curious as to the nature of these dreams. Yes, that's right. As the couple exited the car, Jack said, This is Ewan Campbell and his wife, Heike. Heike and Ewan shook hands with Kaiserman, but deferred to Jack for explanations. Jack figured less was more, and simply said they'd be helping. Mr. Kaiserman was just telling us about some odd dreams centering around the house that he's had over the years. Mr. Kaiserman? Kaiserman shuffled a step back from the group, then another. Jack didn't think the man was acting consciously. Kaiserman started with some hesitation, but then the words flowed. Perhaps he was relieved to finally share the odd visions he'd lived with for so long.
Wherever I start, I end up in the living room. The lights pulse on and off, and there's a thrumming vibration coming from the walls. I can almost hear, but not quite, something off in the distance. I feel like I should be able to hear, but I try and I can't. And I have this terrible feeling that I should be doing something. I'm so frustrated. And there's this anger. And then it's dark and I'm lost.
Kaiserman blinked several times.
That's it.
He looked around at the faces of the 4 people who encircled him.
What does it mean?
Marin and I might have a theory, which Ewan and Heike would be hearing for the first time, since Jack hadn't updated them. We're hoping the house is trying to communicate, just isn't on the right wavelength, or station.
I don't want to talk to it, whatever it is.
Kaiserman backed another few steps away from the group. Enough with the carrot. Time for the stick. Jack cleared his throat. Mr. Kaiserman, we're expecting a very large explosion should this house be moved with its visitor still in residence. We don't have much of a backup plan at this point. Jack caught the slight tip of Ewan's head. They did have a backup plan, but ignored it for now. So in order to prevent a potentially catastrophic event, we need you to at least try to have a conversation with the house. Kaiserman stood, stunned, in the driveway, Finally, he said,
Aren't you people supposed to be professionals? Why do you need me?
Jack took a breath, about to spout some amazingly persuasive garbage, or not, but was interrupted when Marin touched his shoulder. So he waited, as Kaiserman stood in the driveway of the possessed house, eyes darting between the house, the paranormal professionals who couldn't help him, and the street. Jack could guess exactly what the guy was thinking. Face his nightmare. Let the pros take care of the mess, or run. At least that gave them a 30% chance. Math didn't actually work that way, but that 30% lie let him stand here in the driveway and wait, rather than pressuring a guy who was already under too much strain. Finally, Kaiserman said,
Yes.
His feet remained firmly planted, but at least he'd said the word. Chapter 12. It was Marin who got Kaiserman into the house. After politely waiting for what seemed like several minutes, Marin looped her arm in his and simply walked up the drive. She didn't pause at the porch steps, and since Ewan had the foresight to beat them to the door, it was open when she and Kaiserman arrived. By that time, Kaiserman had acquired a much more purposeful step, and he surprised them all by passing the threshold ahead of Marin. Once he was standing in the living room, Kaiserman said in a small voice,
It's much more cheerful than the dreams.
He suddenly seemed old in a way he hadn't before. Jack hadn't caught the nightmare quality of the man's dreams as he'd relayed them. His recounting sounded slightly odd, but nothing about what Kaiserman had described seemed sinister. But Kaiserman's pallor and demeanor expressed exactly how frightening he'd found the dreams. Even now, as he commented on the cheeriness of the room, the man seemed to shrink in on himself. Heike walked from the front door, across the room, to the mantel. Kaiserman tracked her movements until a few feet shy of the fireplace, and then his gaze skittered away.
Mr. Kaiserman?
Heike said, using the German pronunciation.
Sir?
But Kaiserman seemed not to hear. He kept his head averted from the fireplace, as if he couldn't stand to look at it. Ewan moved into his line of sight. Do you hear something?
No, nothing. I don't hear anything at all.
With each pronouncement, Kaiserman's voice rose in volume, and he shook his head with increasing agitation. Ewan approached the man and calmly but firmly placed a hand on his back. You're not crazy. Whatever it is, we believe you. Kaiserman calmed down a little and then made eye contact with Ewan.
You can hear it too?
No, but I believe that you do. But I might be able to... Ewan grasped the man's shoulder with a firm, reassuring grip. If you help me. Jack poked Marin in the ribs and then whispered into her ear, Vulcan mind meld. Star Trek is always the answer. Not remotely the same thing. Telepathy is easier if you're touching. Marin replied in a hushed voice, and then shushed him. Kaiserman's eyes widened.
Okay. What do I do?
Accept that it's trying to speak to you. When Kaiserman nodded, Ewan said, and that it doesn't want to hurt you. Kaiserman looked confused.
I'm not sure. I think she's angry.
Jack would bet cash that Ewan had gambled. And maybe he'd guessed wrong, but the gamble was a good one. The guy and house were talking. In an even, calming voice, Ewan asked, Do you know why she's angry? Kaiserman's eyebrows beetled, and a tear rolled down his cheek.
Not angry. Lonely.
Jack had been watching Kaiserman and Ewan so intently that he'd missed Heike. But her movements flashed in the corner of his eye, and he turned to find her at the mantel, running her hands along the wall, much as she had before. Quietly, she said.
The magic is surging.
Jack nodded. Whatever happened, they'd certainly awoken the thing by bringing Kaiserman here. Mr. Kaiserman! Ewan shook the man's shoulder. Kaiserman's distant gaze sharpened.
Yes, I'm here.
Can you tell her about the house? That we need to move it? Ewan asked, his hand still on Kaiserman's shoulder, but passive now. Marin inched closer to Heike, moving slowly so as not to startle Kaiserman. She tipped her head at Ewan. Was this the backup plan?
Just in case, stay close to Dad. He'll get you out.
Marin's dragon voice echoed in Jack's head. Great. That was the escape plan, not the backup plan. So long, Austin. It was nice knowing you.
She doesn't understand.
Kaiserman's voice was small, swallowed by the dense air. Jack shivered. The change had occurred so slowly that he'd missed it till now. The house was cooler and the air thicker. Tell her that we want to move her and the house, but we need her to be smaller. Jack looked at Ewan. Could he hear what was happening in Kaiserman's head? Ewan said, She needs to pull her magic back, into the hearth, and then we can safely move her. The air became almost unbreathable. Jack's lungs hurt with each pull of breath. The floor rippled, like the shivering skin of a beast. Lights flickered on and off, but it didn't come from the fixtures. The very walls luminesced. Pinkish light, then red. Jack felt like he was inside a reptilian womb. The pulsing beat of a heart, the air thick and moist, a chill to the air. A massive shudder, and then the house was silent. No thrum of a heart pulsing magic echoed in his ears, and the air was once again only pleasantly cool. He shifted his weight, and his joints cracked. How long had he been frozen still in that one spot? He caught sight of Kaiserman, stooped and tired. Ewan led him to the sofa, and the man collapsed in it. He looked distressed. More distressed than he should, given that there wasn't a bunch of magic pulsing all around them. Then Jack had a strange pull of guilt. It's not dead? It was a freaking house, or a magic blob in a house. Why did he care? But the thought bothered him.
No, I don't think so.
Kaiserman's head shot up, as if he'd just realized what he was hearing and saying.
Surely not.
Ewan sat down next to him on the sofa. What do you think?
She's not here.
Kaiserman's tone was cautious.
There's no detectable magic.
Heike moved away from the mantel and sat next to Ewan on the sofa.
Not in the hearth, either.
Kaiserman considered her words.
I think she's gone. Not dead. I think she understood and she left.
Any idea why this house? Why Austin? Jack paced across the small room, loosening stiff joints.
Someone needed refuge.
Kaiserman turned to Ewan.
Do you think it's safe to move the house now?
But who needed refuge? Jack asked. Kaiserman shrugged.
She didn't say.
And he didn't seem the least curious about the answer. Ewan shot Jack a warning look, then answered Kaiserman's question. Yes, you can make plans to move it. But what was she? Jack asked.
I don't know.
Exhausted and looking every bit his age, Kaiserman wobbled as he stood. Once his feet were firmly under him, he asked,
Can I go home now?
Marin appeared at his elbow, once again looping her arm through his, but this time it was to steady not his nerves, but his body. They disappeared through the front door together. Once the door had closed behind them, Jack turned to Ewan. What's the deal? He can't answer any of your questions. The connection he had with that creature wasn't exactly telepathic. More of an instinctual thing. It felt like a psychic umbilical cord between mother and child. That explained the icky inside a womb feeling Jack had. If that's true, it's no wonder Mom was peeved at being cut off. Kaiserman's dad passed unexpectedly. I wonder if there was some piece of information he would have passed along to keep the connection alive between the whatever that thing was and the family. Possibly. One thing I can tell you, she was old. I wouldn't be surprised if she was the same being that inhabited the Black Forest house hundreds of years ago. Yeah, I got that as well, Heike said. Really big, lots of magic, and old. That's about all I got, though. Oh, and the magic surges pulsing through the walls. Marin walked back in. I think he's good. By the time we got to the car, he seemed to be more himself. He just wanted to go home and, I think, forget about all of this. She flashed Jack a smile. Good thing he doesn't owe us anything, because my guess is it would be hell to get him to acknowledge this night ever happened, let alone cough up any cash. Heike stood up. Are we ready to put this house behind us? 3 responses, all emphatically affirmative. Chapter 13. After a very brief discussion in the driveway of the formerly possessed house, Marin, Heike, Ewan, and Jack had all decided to grab a bite to eat at a local Mexican place that Marin and Jack frequented. The meal had been fabulous, and the booze had flowed. Something about a battle fought that hadn't been a battle at all had everyone keyed up, and the bar tab proved it. Since the dragons were almost impossible to get drunk, Marin and Ewan had promised to drive, leaving Jack and Heike to drink themselves under the table. It was well after dark when they all made their way outside, leaving a very satisfied waiter behind. Jack was about to wish Ewan and Heike safe travels home when Marin said, Hey, Dad, do you have a second? She grabbed Jack by the arm as he started to slip away. Jack here had the brilliant idea that I should ask you about something that's been bothering me. Jack tried to tug his arm free, but Marin held tight. I'll just wait in the car. Marin didn't reply, and she didn't let go. Sure. Are we talking in the parking lot? He seemed a little confused. They'd been eating chips, queso, and guacamole for hours, and now she ambushed the guy when they were a foot away from their cars. Jack could understand his confusion. It took a little headache-inducing thought, but Jack finally got it, and she was brilliant. Having a hasty escape nearby when having a family discussion could never hurt. But did she have to drag him into it? Marin had finally let go of his arm, so he made his way to the Range Rover, one very cautious step at a time. He snuck a glance to see if she'd noticed his escape, and blinked. What the hell had he missed? Everyone was hugging and looking happy and teary-eyed. Well, Heike looked teary-eyed. The dragons just had smug, toothy dragon grins. Either way, it looked like reconciliation was in the air. Not that he had a lot of first-hand experience with his own family. Maybe he was a little drunker than he'd thought, because he thought he might be feeling the first flutterings of jealousy. Yeah, he had to be wasted to think he wanted that kind of acceptance from his uptight, middle-class, suburban, neighbor one-upping, judgmental family. He squinted, wobbled, caught himself with one hand on the hood of the Range Rover, and hollered, Can we go home now? Epilogue. Things had been pretty quiet. Bob had returned from a 3-day walkabout. Whether he'd been visiting friends or simply seen the wisdom of a hasty exit from the Austin area, Jack didn't know. And he wasn't likely to find out anytime soon, since he still hadn't cracked the communication barrier. He needed to get on that. But not today. Marin was in the shop, and Bob was correspondingly absent. Hey, what happened to Kaiserman? Jack asked from behind his desk. You said you were going to follow up with him. Yeah. Marin looked up from a dusty pile of newspapers, magazines, and old books, all stacked on the small table that served as their unofficial stock processing area. "Where did you get this stuff?" He slouched in his chair and fiddled with some loose papers. If he looked busy, maybe he could skip processing what had to be mildew-festive newspapers. No clue. Someone might have dropped it off. Kaiserman? Right. He's decided to embrace his retirement fully. He's moving to Belize, which is where I'm moving if you don't start sorting some of the useless stock you bring in. Jack ignored the jib. Belize? Why does that sound so familiar? The bookseller? The one we bribed to keep his mouth shut about the nasty, soul-stealing book? He took the cash and had a party in Belize for about a month. Ah, good thing you keep up with the little details. Jack rolled his chair over to the mini-fridge and pulled out 2 beers. He lifted one in the air. He'd been off booze for a few days after that whole drunken scene with Marin's parents, but he'd fully recovered from his hangover, and all the dust motes floating around were making him thirsty. Sure. Marin took the offered beer. And the book guy did make it back into the country. He's still selling books out of that shabby little shop. I know. I'm just giving you shit. Chris blind copies me on all the assignments you give her. And we didn't bribe him to keep his mouth shut about the book. It was the fire damage you caused trying to catch the book thieves. Yeah, that was a good cover story. Some garbage about cutting-edge tech. Didn't you tell him it was a laser that zapped his store? Jack shrugged. Lasers are cool. What guy doesn't want to believe in lasers? Especially nerdy bookseller guys. Who also sells comics, Marin said. Oh, and Chris doesn't blind copy you on everything. Jack blinked. Was Marin doing research on him? Chris wouldn't. Gotcha. He let it pass, because he'd just realized that there seemed to be convergence happening. Kaiserman picking up and moving so suddenly. Their bookseller who had just happened upon a nasty soul-stealing book and a bizarre cult of money-grubbing murderers. And Belize. You don't think there's something brewing in Belize, do you? Marin downed a quarter of her beer in one long pull. I hear Belize is a nice place to visit. Shit. This has been The Heartbeat in the House, Episode 6, Sporelli Paranormal Investigations. Written by Kate Beret. Narrated by Roberto Scarlato. Copyright 2016 by Catherine G. Cobb. Production copyright 2017 by Catherine G. Cobb.